written a little speech, but I don't think it's worth reading. So I'm just going to ad-lib my experience. My experience is quite different than what Rocky Matayoshi went through during the war. He was living in Hawaii, and I was living in Portland, Oregon, when the war broke out. I was a senior in high school, going to a vocational high school there, and the day after Pearl Harbor, I went back to school, and I expected that I would get some resentment and some, bias toward my race. But somehow they didn't mention anything about me being Japanese or anything like that, and even my teacher didn't say anything. I happened to be about the only Asian in my classes, so they just treated me just like any other American. But that was not the case with outside the school. There were politicians and governors, newspaper editorials. They all said that we were not loyal. They could not trust us. So eventually it came to a point where President Roosevelt signed an executive order 9066 on February 13th, a few months after Pearl Harbor, that authorized the military to evacuate all the Japanese ancestry from the Pacific coast. Now, there was over 120,000 of us living on the Pacific coast, and we had orders to evacuate. That meant that we had to sell all our property and dispose of all our personal belongings and report to an assembly center that they designated at a given time. And we were only allowed to carry one suitcase each. Now, I didn't have very many clothes, but at least I kept my baseball glove. And I don't know what my parents took with them, or my sister. At that time, my brother was already in the service. He had volunteered before he got drafted before the war. So he was in the military, so he wasn't in there. But I was wondering what my parents had carried with them. I'm sure they lost a lot of possessions that they had. Most of the people, they had homes, cars, things like that, and they had to leave it all behind. So when we got to the assembly center, they put us in all different types of places, and some were in California. I heard they housed them in racetracks, like the Santa Anita. And the one in Portland, we were at a Portland Exposition Center, where they had horses and stalls. So some of us were put into those stalls, and until we were there for a few months, until they built the internment camps farther inland. Now, there were 10 internment camps to house the 110,000 of us, of those of Japanese ancestry. And the ones we were sent to was in Idaho, and it was called the Minidoka Relocation Center. Well, that kind of sounded homey, but it really was not a homey place. This place was surrounded by barbed wires and guard towers, and we were just like being in a prison. Well, when I was in that camp, they had started schools for us. Since I didn't graduate from high school in Portland, I had to continue my education in the camp. And when I was in there, in 1943, before I graduated, they called for volunteers to serve in the 442nd to prove that they were loyal. And since I was still in high school, my mother said, well, I should wait. So I didn't volunteer at that time. But when I turned 18, while I was still in high school, the Idaho Draft Board sent me a letter saying that I was classified as 4C. Now, I don't know if any of you know what 4C meant in the Army, or in the draft, that meant that I was an enemy alien. Now, I couldn't figure out how I could be an enemy alien because my brother was already in the service. But if that was the case, then that meant that I couldn't join the Army. So I signed up for a work permit to leave the camp and work on the farms to harvest the crops because there was a shortage of manpower. So I went out to work on the farms for about 2 months. Then I received another letter from the draft board saying I was 1A again, and I was eligible to be drafted. Well, that's when I joined the service and went to basic training. And by the time I joined the full 42nd, they were already in France fighting one of the worst wars and conflict that they had. And after that, we went back to Italy to finish the war. And well, by that time, Rocky was already home because he had the most points for the veterans that got discharged. And I was able to come home on July of 1946. And at that time, they decided to bring the rest of the regiment home. So I came home with the regiment, and when we arrived in New York Harbor, treated us like heroes. And I think, well, we're not all that heroes because all the veterans like Rocky that were before us, they're the ones that really did the hard fighting. And but however, President Truman heard that we had arrived in New York, and he wanted us to be at Washington, D.C. for him to present us with his personal presidential citation. So we all went to Washington, D.C., and we got the citation from President Truman. And at that ceremony, he remarked that we fought not only the enemy, but we fought prejudice, and we won. And I thought, well, that was a pretty good statement from him. And I felt kind of good about that. But when I got discharged, I went back to Chicago because my parents had relocated to Chicago to work as housekeepers at a place called the Three Arts Club. And that was 1300 North Dearborn. And they were kind of happy that they had a job there. And I noticed that they were not bitter about the internment. And somehow they were just grateful that my brother and I came home safely. So all I got to say is that it was nice the way everything happened, and that we finally proved that we were Americans just like everybody else. Thank you.